You're listening to On Top of the World Radio. I'm Chris Story. What my mom calls the greatest show on earth is happening right now. Again, want to thank Horizon Satellite, Horizon Wireless. Call them today at 226-3130. If you want incredibly fast internet service, do what I do. Call Horizon Satellite, 226-3130. We're so happy with our service here. We've got it at home as well, and it truly is fast. Please help me welcome to the program Lyndsay Hobson. She's Communications Manager for Enstar Gas Company. Hi, Lyndsay. Thank you, and welcome to the Top of the World.
Hi. Thank you, Chris, for having me.
You took a recent trip to Los Angeles. I want to talk about that. But first of all, how long have you been with Enstar?
For just over 4 years now.
Oh, okay. All right. Excellent. And Communications Manager, you're dealing with outreach and just sending the message out. You're the person. You're the go-to person.
That's right. I wear quite a few hats here at Enstar.
Which is in part, I want to talk about the tariff here in Homer in just a minute, but in part, that's what happened with the recent earthquake. You were somebody asked you to come out and speak at a conference in Los Angeles because of how, what you went through, what your company and organization went through during that big earthquake. How did that presentation go? How were you received?
I think that people were really amazed by the impact of the earthquake, the amount of damage that the city the south central part of the state sustained, and the types of communication and just sort of the around the clock response that we had that was triggered immediately following the earthquake.
Would you say, at least from the gas company, from the Enstar's perspective, is everything, kind of back online and put back to normal, or are you all still working on mending and repairing?
I think for the most part, we are we're back online. We no longer have a backlog of gas leak orders, but here in our administrative building, we have repairs that are ongoing, and I think it will be a while, but. For our day-to-day operations, we've been back to normal for quite some time now.
Talking with Lyndsay Hobson, Communications Manager for Enstar. Lyndsay, a lot of people, we're broadcasting around South Central, and some people aren't affected by news events that appeared in the Homer News recently. So I'll just give a brief history, and you please let me know where I've got it wrong or correct me if I'm tweaking this just a little bit. But here's what I think happened. Long about 2008-9, Governor Parnell basically was willing to put up the 8-point-something million to extend the gas line from Anchor Point to Homer. Wanted some skin in the game, did he? Thus, the people of Homer, Ketchikan City, Southern Peninsula folks, were going to be on the hook for roughly $2.5 million of the estimated $10-point-some-odd million construction. Now, this is just the extension from mainline from Anchor Point to Homer. To close the gap, there was a tariff was discovered that would allow for the recouping of monies fronted by Enstar to the tune of $2.5 million. This dollar per MCF would be repaying that $2.5 million, or putting your company back to whole, making your washing that investment away, $2.5 million per MCF, and it was estimated that would take 10 years. And so what I think, as of this point, what I think we're seeing in the newspaper, and Homer Mayor Kastner has brought this to light, that we in fact now owe north of $5 million. Am I portraying this at all accurately?
I think, yes, for the most part.
Okay. So over $5 million. Now, part of that has to be, and I'm just going to put this out there as pure conjecture. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. Part of it is probably we're not using as much gas as was projected. People probably didn't get online as quickly and aren't using as much gas as projected. And then there's an internal rate of return on those monies that may or may not have been taken into effect. Nobody that I've talked to knew about that internal rate of return. On the $2.5 million is actually interest that is accruing. And that is a bulk of that $5 million, correct?
That's correct. So what happened was that the way the state grant was set up, that the grant was a fixed dollar figure, with the idea that the remaining construction costs would be covered by Enstar and repaid to Enstar through this $1 per MCF surcharge. And so the project actually had the final project costs were just over $11 million. And so the starting balance was a bit higher than anticipated. So that's part of the issue. And then with regard to the rate of return that's included in that, we call it a kayak, the money that Enstar forwarded to the Kenai or to the Homer area. That was the surcharge itself was something that had already gone before the commission, and Enstar had been cross-examined specifically on the issue of whether or not it was appropriate to include the rate of return in the kayak amount. And after vetting the issue and thoroughly examining the proposal, the commission did determine that was appropriate to do. And I think that when I wasn't, this is before my time, but when I look back at the documentation and the presentations, total construction costs was inclusive of that rate of return. And so that $1 per MCF charge covers the kayak amount, which is also includes that rate of return.
Okay, so
but what happened?
Okay, go ahead.
So how it ended up growing was that we had to figure out, we had to come up, with a time frame for a repayment schedule, and so based on the number of customers we thought would connect, and based on the what we made a calculation of estimating annual consumption. And by how we came up with that consumption number was we looked at the average consumption for folks already on the peninsula, and that was about 148 MCF. And then we dialed it down to 140 MCF for Homer. And we realized that Homer area residents were actually only consuming 90 MCF per year rather than 140. So it means that they're paying on average $90 of surcharge in a year rather than the $140 we thought that would be drawing from that account. And so as a consequence, the account has grown. And if you want, I can talk about the filing and how we're proposing to address that.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to hear that. Just in case you've tuned in, I'm talking with Lyndsay Hobson, Communications Manager of Enstar Natural Gas Company. And we're talking about the kayak that Lyndsay refers to as a contribution in aid of construction, CIAC,
That's right.
kayak. And Lyndsay, so I'm looking at a letter from Colleen Starring, the president at the time. I'm not sure if she's still the president, but back then she was the president of the company. And it says, utilizing 2011 customer growth assumptions, Enstar has calculated it would recover as a contribution in aid of construction $2.5 million over a 10-year period. So I think the average person, and I'm very anxious to hear what your proposal is, but the average person would read this letter from the president and think, okay, assuming that calculation is off by some number based on the fact that not as many people hooked up as quickly as you'd anticipated and we're using a little less, I could understand the $2.5 million being extended beyond the 10 years, like maybe it takes 12 or 14 years to pay back. But can you relate then to the average person who is looking now at over $5 million? The song about owing your soul to the company store, it's almost as though this will never be paid back. It's growing so exponentially quickly. I'm hopeful that the solution includes removal of that, I don't know how else to call it, but an interest rate or what is actually an internal rate of return on your money. I'm hoping that just gets removed. Is that part of the solution?
Partially.
Okay.
So what we filed with the Regulatory Commission, this is another attempt that we're making at trying to address this balance. And our filing proposes to separate out that return that you might call like an interest portion of the kayak, separating that and having a separate account for specifically that pot of funds and amortizing that over 30 years. And then which would reduce the balance back to the original kayak amount. And then with regard to that original amount, Enstar will no longer collect equity. It's equity return. And see, a rate of return has two components. There's the return on equity, and then there's the debt rate. And so we are breaking that out. And so we are giving up the opportunity to basically earn on that investment. And it will just be the debt and then the taxes associated with that original amount. So our hope is that with the growth and the consumption that we're seeing now, and we've also adjusted all of these figures for actual data that we now have in Homer. And so our hope is that now having those actual numbers, taking out the equity component, Enstar's earnings on that component, that we can draw down that balance.
Interesting. And I want to make sure that I'm following that, because you're talking to a very lay person. And so I think I probably represent some of the folks listening, and others are probably leaping ahead of me in this, but I want to make sure I'm following. And so in other words, Lyndsay, you're saying that separate pot of money on that rate of return, the interest pot, if you don't mind me calling it that, would
Sure.
still exist. And so then would also the original 2.5, which sounds like it ballooned to 3.5 million with increase of cost of construction. What would then be the balance owed by the people of Homer and Kachemak City? What would this new approach? Would it just be splitting it up over a longer period of time, or would it actually reduce what is owed?
Well, it would. It's the same amount that's owed. It's just that it's not growing to nearly the extent. And so each month, it has been increasing because the consumption has not been enough to meet that $1 per MCF. In reality, it hasn't been sufficient to cover the carrying costs of the money that Enstar provided to complete the project. And so, so the intent is to, we looked at a variety of options and ultimately determined that this approach was the best because we want the least impact on Homer area residents. And so we are able to do this and not increase the monthly charge, not add a surcharge or a fee, not increase the cost, but just spreading out over a longer period of time. And I've looked at some information just to try to see where we are in terms of how affordable is natural gas in Homer, given this surcharge in it. And it looks like it's still half the cost of alternative fuel sources. And so I think that through this filing, I think we're hopeful that we can address this balance and prevent it from continuing to grow and continue to provide this clean, efficient fuel source to the Homer area.
I'm, by the way, just to refresh here, talking with Lyndsay Hobson, Communication Manager for Enstar Nat Gas Company. You're listening to On Top of the World Radio. And I just have a few minutes left, Lyndsay, and I'll let you go. But I'm curious. So I'm reading the resolution 12-017. This is a resolution of the city of Homer at the time, drafted by City Manager Walt Reading. And